Apache warrior saved a settler bride. Until she pointed to his mother's grave, he led the raid that killed her husband, then spent 3 days saving her life. But when she pointed to that weathered grave marker, the Apache warrior realized some sins can never be buried deep enough. The buzzards knew before Aiyana did. They circled lazy and patient above the overturned wagon, their shadows dancing across sand already darkened with blood. The desert stretched endless in every direction, broken only by the scattered bones of sage brush and the cruel teeth of distant mountains. Heat shimmered up from the earth like the ghosts of the newly dead. Aiyana urged his paint horse forward, the animal's hooves making soft sounds in the sand. His war paint had long since dried to flakes on his bronze skin, and dust coated the eagle feathers in his black hair. The raid had been swift and merciless, as all raids must be when winter hunger gnaws at children's bellies and the white settlers push deeper in his sacred hunting grounds. But something had gone wrong. The other warriors had ridden north with their prizes, leaving him to search for strays. Now he found himself staring at death he had helped create. The wagon lay on its side like a wounded animal. Flowers spilled white across red earth, and torn fabric caught on sagebrush like prayer flags for the damned. 2 men lay motionless in the afternoon heat, one still clutching a rifle that had done him no good, the other face down with arrows sprouting from his back like deadly flowers. But it was the third figure that made Aiyana's breath catch in his throat. She was alive. The woman lay crumpled against a wagon wheel, her wedding dress torn and stained with dust and blood. White lace had been made for church altars and gentle parlors, not for dying in the desert sun. Her blonde hair had come loose from its careful braids and spread around her face like spun gold. One small hand pressed against a wound in her side, fingers bright red with her own blood. Aiyana should have finished what the raid began. Should have taken her scalp, her belongings, her life. Should have left her for the buzzards and the coyotes in the endless, patient desert. His people were at war. She was the enemy. These truths sat heavy in his chest, solid as stones. But when she opened her eyes and looked at him, something cracked inside his warrior's heart. Her eyes were green as spring water in the hidden canyons. Green as the first shoots of grass after winter's grip loosens. And in them he saw no begging, no pleading for mercy. Just a fierce, quiet acceptance that made her seem less like prey and more like something sacred. She tried to speak, lips cracked and dry. No words came. Aiyana dismounted and approached slowly, hands visible and empty. She watched him with those impossible green eyes, ready for death, but not welcoming it. When he knelt beside her, she didn't flinch away, didn't scream, just kept looking at him like she was trying to read the truth written in his face. The wound in her side was deep, but not fatal, if it was cleaned and tended. If she had water, if she had shelter from the killing sun, if someone cared whether she lived or died. His war party was miles away by now. No one would know what mercy looked like in the empty desert. Aiyana lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. She made a small sound of pain, but didn't resist. Her head fell against his shoulder, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his chest. Life, stubborn and determined, refusing to let go. He secured her on his horse and mounted behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her steady. Her blood soaked into his buckskin shirt, warm and red and accusing. The dead men stared with empty eyes as he rode away, leaving them to the desert and the patient buzzards and the judgment of whatever gods watched over fools and cowards and traitors to their own people. The hidden canyon was 3 miles south, a place where spring water bubbled up from deep earth and cottonwoods offered shade. His grandmother had told him stories of this place, how it had sheltered the people during the long drought years before the white man came. Now it would shelter a white woman who should have been his enemy. As they rode, she drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words he couldn't understand. Once she said a name, Thomas, with such tenderness that Aiyana felt shame burn in his throat. Thomas, probably the dead man with the rifle. Probably her husband, or the man who was meant to be. The sun was setting when they reached the canyon, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. Aiyana made camp with practiced efficiency, fire for warmth, water heated in his metal cup, clean cloth torn from his own shirt for bandages. She woke when he cleaned her wound, biting back a cry of pain that spoke of strength learned through suffering. "Please," she whispered, the first clear word she'd spoken. Not begging for her life, just asking for gentleness in dying, if dying was what came next. But Aiyana wasn't planning to let her die. As night settled over the desert like a dark blanket, he fed the fire and watched her sleep. The flames danced between them, casting shifting shadows on the canyon walls. Light and dark, enemy and savior. The space between what was right and what felt true. Tomorrow would bring its own questions, its own impossible choices. But tonight, in the flickering firelight, an Apache warrior and a white woman breathed the same air and dreamed different dreams of the same cruel, beautiful desert. And somewhere in the darkness, the dead whispered secrets that neither of them was ready to hear. For 3 days, he saved the life of a woman whose husband he'd killed. She spoke his language in fever dreams, calling out for the dead. But when she finally opened her eyes, she thanked him in broken Spanish like he was an angel, not her destroyer. Water was sacred in the desert, and Aiyana brought it to her like an offering. He cupped it in his calloused palms from the spring that bubbled cold and clear from the canyon's heart, carrying it to where she lay on a bed of his own blankets. Drop by precious drop, he let it fall between her cracked lips, watching her throat work to swallow. Sometimes she was awake enough to drink. Sometimes the fever took her away to places where the dead still walked. 3 days passed this way. On the first day, she burned with heat that had nothing to do with the desert sun. Her skin felt like fire beneath his touch when he checked the wound at her side. The bleeding had stopped, but poison lived in the tear the arrow had left. She spoke constantly in her fever dreams, words tumbling out in English that she thought he couldn't understand. But Aiyana knew more of the white man's tongue than most of his people. Years of trading, years of watching settlements spread like grass fire across Apache land, years of listening to promises spoken in a language that seemed made for breaking oaths. He understood enough. "Thomas," she whispered over and over, her head turning restlessly on the blanket. "Thomas, where are you? I can't find my way to the church." Her voice carried the weight of a heart that didn't yet know it was broken. "Mama's pearls. I lost Mama's pearls in the sand." Aiyana fed dried venison into the fire and said nothing. The dead man's name sat heavy between them like smoke that wouldn't clear. On the second day, the fever broke for hours at a time. She would surface from the burning dreams like someone climbing out of deep water, gasping and confused but alive. Her green eyes would find him across the small fire, and he would see fear flicker there, but not the wild terror he expected. Something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "Agua," she whispered once, using one of the few Spanish words she knew. "Water." He brought it to her without hesitation, and when their fingers brushed as she took the cup, neither pulled away. Her skin was cool now, the fever temporarily beaten back by mountain spring water and the tough bark tea his grandmother had taught him to brew. "Gracias," she managed, the word careful on her tongue. "Thank you." Aiyana nodded and returned to his place beside the fire. The silence between them held weight, but it wasn't the crushing silence of enemies. It was the quiet of two people learning to breathe the same air without bloodshed. She watched him work, splitting wood, preparing food, tending the fire that kept the night's chill at bay. Her eyes followed the methodical movements of his hands, the careful way he arranged each stick to keep the flames burning steady. When he caught her watching, she didn't look away. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly on the second evening, her voice still rough from fever but growing stronger. Aiyana fed another branch to the fire and considered her words. What had she expected? A savage with painted face and bloodthirsty eyes? A demon from the stories white mothers told their children to keep them close to home? He handed her a piece of the rabbit he'd snared and cooked, seasoned with wild sage and salt from his leather pouch. She ate slowly, as if each bite was a small victory over death. On the third day, she told him about the wagon train. Not directly, and not all at once. The words came in pieces between sips of water and bites of food, like a story told around a dying campfire. She spoke of Missouri farms and letters from Thomas describing the green valleys of California, of her father's blessing and her mother's tears, of the long miles across plains and mountains, following wheel ruts worn deep by the dreams of other pilgrims. There was this woman, Sarah said, stirring the coals with a stick he'd given her. Rebecca. She wasn't young, maybe 40 or so, took care of everyone like we were her own children. Her voice grew soft with memory. She used to say the desert wasn't our enemy. Said it was just honest. Wouldn't lie to you about what it could take. Aiyana's hand stilled on the water cup he was cleaning. Rebecca taught me some Spanish. Said I'd need it in California, with all the Mexican families there. Sarah smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. She was kind to everyone, even the Indians we met along the trail. Said kindness was a language everybody understood, no matter what words they spoke. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up toward the star-filled sky. Aiyana felt something twist deep in his chest, a pain that had nothing to do with physical wounds. She got sick near the end, Sarah continued, her voice growing heavy. Fever like I had. But there wasn't anyone to take care of her the way you. She stopped, seeming to realize what she'd been about to say. The way you took care of me. The silence stretched between them, full of questions neither was ready to ask. Sarah pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders and watched the flames dance. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. She died 2 days before we reached the settlement. We buried her in a place with cottonwoods, near a little spring. She would have liked that, I think. The sound of water. Aiyana closed his eyes and felt the weight of 3 days' worth of kindness settle on his shoulders like stones. 3 days of bringing water to an enemy. 3 days of gentle hands and careful tending. 3 days of pretending he was something other than what he'd chosen to become. When he opened his eyes, Sarah was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Curious, grateful, something else that made his throat tight. "What's your name?" she asked. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Names had power. Names made strangers into people, enemies into something more complicated than arrows and war paint could solve. "Aiyana," he finally said. His voice sounded strange in the firelight, rusty from 3 days of careful silence. She nodded as if the name satisfied something in her. "Aiyana, that's beautiful." She paused, then added, "I'm Sarah. Sarah Collins." A shadow crossed her face. I was going to be Sarah Matthews after the wedding. The dead man's name hung between them again. Thomas, the man with the rifle who died, trying to protect what he loved. Sarah shifted on the blankets, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing wound. "Tomorrow," she said, I should go back. To the settlement. They'll be wondering what happened to us." Aiyana nodded, though something in his chest pulled tight at the thought. Tomorrow, the careful peace of the hidden canyon would end. Tomorrow, she would return to her people, and he would return to his. The desert would swallow these 3 days like it swallowed everything else, blood and kindness, mercy and war, all just dust beneath an endless sky. But tonight, the fire burned warm between them, and the spring sang its ancient song, and for a few more hours, 2 broken people could pretend the world beyond the canyon walls didn't exist. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, keeping their own counsel about the strange mercy that bloomed in unlikely places. She knelt beside the grave marker and traced the carved letters with trembling fingers. "Rebecca Summers," she whispered. "She was like a mother to me." The Apache warrior's blood turned to ice, because he knew exactly who Rebecca was and how she died. The morning came too soon, breaking over the canyon rim like spilled gold. Sarah was strong enough to walk now, though she moved careful and slow, one hand pressed to her side where the wound was healing. Aiyana watched her fold his blankets with practiced efficiency, her movements speaking of a woman raised to work hard and waste nothing. The fire had burned down to embers, and the spring sang its eternal song to empty air. "I know the way," she said, not meeting his eyes. "You don't have to. You've done enough." But Aiyana was already saddling his horse. Some debts couldn't be walked away from, and some roads were too dangerous for a wounded woman to travel alone. The desert between the hidden canyon and the settlement held rattlesnakes and scorpions, flash floods, and Apache war parties that might not show the mercy he had chosen. They rode together through the morning, sharing the paint horse's back like they had shared water and silence for 3 days. Sarah sat before him, her back straight despite the pain he knew she carried. Her blonde hair caught the early light and threw it back like captured sunbeams. The land around them was harsh and beautiful, all red stone and endless sky. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentries, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the burning sun. In the distance, dust devils danced across the flats, spinning stories only the wind could read. They didn't speak much. What was there to say? That these had been the strangest 3 days of both their lives? That kindness could bloom between enemies like desert flowers after rain? That tomorrow they would return to being what the world expected them to be, Apache warrior and white settler, predator and prey? Some truths were too heavy for words. It was near midday when they saw the crosses. A cluster of weathered wooden markers stood on a small rise, casting short shadows in the climbing sun. Someone had chosen this spot with care, high ground with a view of the distant mountains, a place where the wind could carry prayers up to whatever heaven the dead were seeking. Sarah's body went rigid against his chest. "Stop," she whispered. Aiyana reined in the horse, and she slid down before he could help her. Her legs were unsteady, but she walked toward the grave markers with the determined steps of someone fulfilling a sacred duty. There were maybe a dozen crosses, some newer than others. Names carved deep in a wood that had been bleached silver by sun and scoured smooth by desert wind. Sarah moved among them like she was walking through a garden of memory, her fingers trailing over carved letters that spelled out lives cut short by distance and disease, accident and violence. She stopped before one marker that stood apart from the others, newer with still showing the marks of careful carving. Her hand shook as she traced the letters, and Aiyana felt something cold settle in his stomach like winter water. "Rebecca Summers," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. 1815 to 1871. She died as she lived with love for all. The name hit Aiyana like a physical blow. His vision went white at the edges, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The desert around him seemed to tilt and spin, the sun too bright, the air too thin. Rebecca. Not just any Rebecca. Not some stranger from Sarah's wagon train stories. Rebecca Summers. The kind white woman who had sheltered his dying mother through the bitter winter of his 15th year. The woman who shared her food when the snows ran deep and game was scarce. The woman who spoke gentle words in broken Apache and treated sick children like they were her own. The woman who had taught his mother English words and learned Apache ones in return, building bridges with smiles and patience and gifts of warm bread. The woman his war party had killed 2 summers past. Sarah knelt beside the grave, her wedding dress spreading around her like fallen snow. She was everything good about the white people coming west, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. When others were afraid of the Indians we met, Rebecca would go right up to them. She'd share food, try to talk. She said the desert was big enough for everyone if we just learned to see each other as human. Aiyana's throat felt like it was closing. He remembered that winter, remembered his mother's fever and the white woman who appeared like a spirit with medicine and soup in gentle hands. Rebecca had stayed for weeks, nursing not just his mother, but half the tribe through the sickness that had come with a harsh cold. She'd saved his mother's life, and he had taken hers. The Apache came to her settlement at dawn, Sarah continued, unaware that she was speaking to one of the men who'd painted his face for war that morning. She tried to make peace, tried to talk to them. Even when the fighting started, she kept trying to help people escape. She could have run, could have saved herself, but Sarah's voice broke, and she pressed her face into her hands. Aiyana dismounted on legs that felt like water. He wanted to run, wanted to ride away from this place where the dead kept books of all his sins. But his feet carried him forward until he stood behind Sarah, looking down at the grave of the woman who had been a mother to her and a savior to his own blood. She was carrying this when they found her, Sarah whispered, pulling something from the pocket of her torn dress. The other women thought I should have it. Said Rebecca would want someone to remember her kindness. In Sarah's palm lay a small beaded bracelet. The pattern worked in traditional Apache style, blue and white and red, the colors of sky and snow and blood. The colors of peace between peoples who had forgotten how to speak each other's names without anger. Aiyana knew that bracelet. His mother had made it during the long winter nights while Rebecca sat beside their fire, the two women working with their hands while snow fell outside and death stalked the weak. His mother had given it to Rebecca as a gift of gratitude, a promise of friendship that was meant to last beyond the season of their meeting. He'd taken it from Rebecca's body when he found her after the raid, grief and rage warring in his chest. Took it and buried it with his mother when the fever finally claimed her the following spring. A circle of guilt and sorrow wound tight around his heart. But here it was, impossible and real, in the hands of the woman whose life he'd saved and whose husband he'd killed. Rebecca told me she got it from an Apache woman whose life she'd helped save, Sarah said softly. She wore it every day, said it reminded her that kindness was a language everyone could speak. She looked up at Aiyana with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams. She would have liked that you saved me. She would have said it proved what she always believed, that we don't have to be enemies. The desert wind picked up, stirring dust around the grave markers and carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Aiyana stared down at Rebecca's grave and felt the weight of 2 summers' worth of war and grief settle on his shoulders like a burial shroud. Sarah was still looking at him, waiting for some response to her story of the white woman's kindness, waiting for comfort from the very man who had ended that kindness with arrow and war cry and the hot fury of a people pushed too far. The truth sat in his throat like swallowed stone, too big to speak and too heavy to carry much longer. When he pulled out that same beaded bracelet, the one he'd taken from Rebecca's dead body, the settler bride finally understood who had saved her life. But her reaction would break every rule of revenge the desert had ever known. The truth spilled from Aiyana's throat like blood from a mortal wound. I killed her. 3 words. Simple and sharp as arrowheads, cutting through the desert air between them. Sarah's hand froze on the beaded bracelet, her green eyes lifting to meet his with a confusion that would soon turn to something else entirely. Rebecca Summers, he continued, each word a stone dropped into still water. I led the war party that took her life. The silence that followed was not the comfortable quiet they had shared beside their campfire. This was the silence of the grave, heavy with the weight of revelation and the sharp intake of breath that comes before the scream. Sarah's face went white as desert bone. The bracelet trembled in her palm like a living thing. You, she whispered, then stopped. Her throat worked as if the words were too big to swallow. You're the one who. Aiyana reached slowly into his medicine pouch, drawing out an identical bracelet, blue and white and red beads strung on sinew, the pattern perfect match to the one in her hands. His mother's work, Rebecca's gift, the circle of connection he had carried like a curse for 2 long summers. My mother made this, he said quietly, made 2 of them, one for Rebecca, one for herself. During the winter when Rebecca saved her life, Sarah stared at the twin bracelets, one in her palm, one in his, as understanding dawned like terrible sunrise across her features. Rebecca stayed with my people through the fever sickness, Aiyana continued, the words coming easier now that the dam had broken. She could have left when the snows cleared, could have returned to her own kind. But she stayed until my mother was strong again, until all the children were well. The wind picked up, stirring dust around Rebecca's grave marker and carrying the scent of distant rain. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like dark thoughts made visible. When the soldiers came the next spring, Aiyana said, "When they burned our winter camp and scattered my people like leaves, I thought Rebecca had told them where to find us. I thought her kindness was a lie, her friendship a trick to make us weak." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Didn't run. Just listened as the terrible story unfolded between them. "I was wrong," he whispered. Rebecca tried to stop the soldiers, stood between them and the children, begging them to show mercy. But I didn't know that then. All I knew was that my mother was dying, and the white soldiers had found her sacred places, and someone had to pay. The settlement appeared as a shimmer on the horizon. Buildings and people, and the promise of return to a world where Apache and settler meant enemy and prey, predator and victim. But here, beside Rebecca's grave, such simple divisions seemed as fragile as morning frost. 2 summers later, when the hunger came and my people were desperate, I painted my face for war. Aiyana's voice grew heavy with the weight of memory. I told myself it was justice. Told myself Rebecca's people owed us blood for blood. When we found her settlement, he stopped, unable to continue. But Sarah's voice, soft and broken, finished the story. She tried to make peace. Even as you were killing everyone around her, she tried to make peace. Aiyana nodded, shame burning in his throat like swallowed fire. She spoke Apache words she remembered. "Call me nephew," the way she used to call me during the winter she stayed with us. His voice cracked, even as I drew my bow. They knelt together beside Rebecca's grave, 2 broken people mourning the same woman for different reasons. The beaded bracelets lay between them like prayers made manifest, blue and white and red threads binding past to present, sorrow to sorrow, sin to the hope of redemption. "I kept the bracelet," Aiyana said finally. "Buried it with my mother when the fever took her the following spring. Thought I was burying my shame with her bones." He looked at the identical bracelet in Sarah's hands. But some things refused to stay buried. Sarah was crying now, tears falling onto the dusty ground like the first drops of the approaching storm. But when she looked at him, Aiyana saw something that stopped his heart. Not hatred, not fear, not the rage he deserved. Forgiveness. "She would have forgiven you," Sarah said quietly. "Rebecca, she would have said you were grieving. That grief makes people do terrible things. She would have forgiven you, and then she would have asked what could be done to heal the wound." Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. In the desert, rain was a blessing and a violence both, washing away the old world to make room for whatever might grow in its place. "I can't bring back Thomas," Aiyana said. "Can't bring back Rebecca, or my mother, or any of the dead we've made between us." "I know," Sarah whispered. "I can't undo the raid, or the killing, or the choice I made to become a warrior instead of a bridge builder like my mother wanted. I know." The rain fell harder now, turning dust to mud and filling the air with the clean scent of water on stone. Sarah stood slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing wound, and held out her hand to him. "But you can choose what comes next," she said. "Rebecca taught me that. Every morning is a new chance to build something better from the pieces of what's been broken." Aiyana took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. Together they stood beside Rebecca's grave as the desert storm washed over them, soaking their clothes and streaming down their faces like tears the sky was crying for all the unnecessary sorrow in the world. The settlement was visible now through the rain, sanctuary for Sarah, judgment for him. His people would call him traitor for showing mercy to an enemy. Her people would call for his blood when they learned who had saved her life. The easy answers of war and revenge would reassert themselves like gravity pulling stones back to earth. But for this moment, standing in the desert rain beside the grave of a woman who had believed in the possibility of peace, 2 enemies had chosen to see each other as human. Had chosen forgiveness over vengeance, mercy over justice, the hard work of healing over the easy satisfaction of hate. As they walked toward the settlement together, the Apache warrior and the settler bride, the killer and the saved, the storm clouds began to break apart. Sunlight speared through the gaps like arrows of gold, illuminating a landscape washed clean and ready for whatever seeds might take root in ground made fertile by the marriage of water and hope. Behind them, Rebekah's grave marker stood witness to the rain and the revelation, the wind and the choice to break the endless cycle of blood for blood. The beaded bracelets in their hands caught the emerging sunlight, blue and white and red threads binding not just their separate sorrows, but their shared possibility of redemption. In the end, some stories are not about the violence that breaks us, but about the grace that helps us heal. Some wars end not with victory or defeat, but with the simple, radical act of refusing to add more sorrow to a world that already holds too much. The desert would remember this day. The stones would remember. And perhaps, in the remembering, others might find their own way from hatred back to hope.